Hi, I am Sudhir Sugadan from 6th year. Today we are going to discuss about cohort study. So let's start from the introduction. Introduction to cohort studies. A cohort study is a type of an observational study in which a group of individuals known as a cohort is followed over time to determine the incidence of a specific health outcome or a disease. Cohort studies can be used to investigate the association between an exposure and an outcome as well as to identify the potential risk factors for a disease. Here is an image showing cohort study. Now we will talk about the difference between prospective and retrospective cohort studies. Prospective cohort studies involve identifying a group of individuals who do not have the outcome of interest at the beginning of the study and then following them over time to determine the incidence of the outcome. Whereas retrospective cohort studies involves identifying a group of individuals who already have the outcome of interest and then looking back at their past exposure history to determine the association between exposure and the outcome. Here is an example of retrospective cohort study. Now, the advantages and disadvantages of cohort studies. The advantages of cohort studies is that they can establish temporal relationships between exposure and outcome, which is not possible in cross-sectional studies. Additionally, cohort studies can measure multiple outcomes associated with a single exposure, allowing for a more comprehensive analysis. However, cohort studies can be expensive and time-consuming to conduct, and loss to follow-up can be a problem, particularly in long-term studies. Design of a cohort study. First, we will be selecting a study population. The selection of a study population is an essential step in designing a cohort study. The population should be selected based on the research question and the availability of the resources. The inclusion criteria should be clearly defined to ensure that the cohort is representative of the population being studied. The exclusion criteria should also be clearly defined to eliminate the individuals who may not be suitable for the study. Now let's talk about defining exposure and outcome variables. Defining the exposure and outcome variables is another important step in designing a cohort study. The exposure variable is the factor that the researcher is interested in studying. The outcome variable is the disease or health outcome of interest. The exposure and outcome variables should be clearly defined and measured accurately to ensure that the results of the studies are valid and reliable. Following up participants in a cohort study. Following up participants in a cohort study is critical to ensure that the data collected are accurate and complete. The follow-up period should be specified before the study begins, and efforts should be made to minimize loss to follow-up. The follow-up can be conducted through various means such as telephone interviews, mailed questionnaires, and medical records. Now we will discuss about types of cohort studies. Section-wise we will discuss. So first one is open versus closed cohorts. An open cohort is a type of cohort study where individuals are allowed to enter and leave the cohort during the study period. Individuals who enter the cohort during the study period are referred to as incident cases, while individuals who leave the cohort are referred to as censored. Open cohorts are useful when the research questions is focused on the incidence of a disease or health outcome in a population over time. A closed cohort is a type of cohort study where individuals are enrolled at the beginning of the study and followed over time without allowing new individuals to enter the cohort. Closed cohorts are useful when the research question is focused on the risk factors for a disease or health outcome in a population. Now the second section is about concurrent versus non-concurrent cohorts. A concurrent cohort study involves the collection of exposure and outcome data at the same time, which means that exposure and outcome are measured simultaneously. Concurrent cohort studies are useful when exposure and outcome data are readily available and when there is no need for a long follow-up period. A non-concurrent cohort study involves collecting the exposure data at one point in time and then following the cohort over time to measure the outcome. Non-concurrent cohort studies are useful when exposure data is not readily available or when the study requires a long follow-up period. Now the next one is population-based versus hospital-based cohorts. A population-based cohort study involves selecting a sample of individuals from the general population and following them over time to determine the incidence of a disease or health outcome. Population-based cohorts are useful when the research question is focused on the incidence of a disease or health outcome in a defined population. In contrast, a hospital-based cohort study involves selecting a sample of individuals from a hospital or healthcare facility and following them over time to determine the incidence of a disease or health outcome. Hospital-based cohorts are useful when the research questions is focused on a specific disease or health outcome that is treated in a particular healthcare facility. In summary, the type of cohort study selected depends on the research question, the availability of the resources, and the study design. Understanding the different types of cohort studies can help researchers select the most appropriate study design to answer their research questions. Now, analyzing data from a cohort study. So first we need to see the measures of the association. Measures of association are used to assess the relationship between the exposure and the outcome variables in a cohort study. The three most commonly used measures of association in cohort studies are relative risk, absolute risk, and hazard ratio. Relative risk is the ratio of the risk of developing a disease or health outcome in the exposed group compared to the risk in the unexposed group. It is calculated by dividing the incidence rate of a exposed group by the incidence rate of a unexposed group. Whereas absolute risk is the difference in the risk of developing a disease or health outcome between the exposed and unexposed groups. It is calculated by subtracting the incidence rate of the unexposed group from the incidence rate of the exposed group. Next one is hazard ratio. Hazard ratio is a measure of the relative risk of an event occurring over time. It is calculated using survival analysis technique and is particularly useful when the outcome of interest is time to event data. Next one is controlling for confounding variables. Confounding variables are variables that are associated with both the exposure and the outcome variables but are not on the causal pathway. Controlling for confounding variables is important to ensure that the results of the study are not biased. There are several methods for controlling the confounding of variables in a cohort study, including stratification, matching, regression analysis. Stratification involves dividing the cohort into subgroups based on the confounding variable and analyzing the data separately for each subgroups. Matching involves selecting individuals in the exposed and unexposed groups who have similar characteristics for the confounding variable. Regression analysis involves including the confounding variable as a covariate in the analysis. Now we will see applications of cohort studies. First, cohort studies in public health research. Cohort studies are an important tool in public health research as they can help identify the distribution and determinants of the disease in a population. They can also provide valuable information on the natural history of disease and the effectiveness of public health interventions. Cohort studies can be used to investigate the relationship between exposure to environmental factors, lifestyle factors, and health outcomes. They can also help identify the risk factors for a disease and evaluate the effectiveness of preventive interventions. For example, a cohort study could be used to investigate the relationship between exposure to air pollution and respiratory diseases such as asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases (COPD). The study could follow a group of individuals over time and measure their exposure to air pollution and any respiratory symptoms or diseases they develop. The study could also identify potential confounding factors such as smoking and control for them in the analysis. Cohort studies to evaluate effectiveness of interventions. Cohort studies can also be used to evaluate the effectiveness of interventions. This type of study design can help determine whether a particular intervention, such as a vaccine or a new treatment, is effective in reducing the incidence or prevalence of a disease or improving health outcomes. For example, a cohort study could be used to evaluate the effectiveness of a new cancer treatment. The study could follow a group of individuals with a specific type of cancer and compare those who receive the new treatment to those who receive standard care. The study could measure the incidence of disease, reoccurrence, or death over time and compare the outcomes between the two groups. Cohort studies to identify risk factors for diseases. Cohort studies can also be used to identify risk factors for a disease. This type of study design can help identify potential risk factors that may contribute to the development of a disease or a condition. For example, a cohort study could be used to investigate the relationship between diet and the development of type 2 diabetes. The study could follow a group of individuals over time and measure their dietary habits, such as types and amount of food they consume. The study could also measure the incidence of type 2 diabetes in the cohort and compare the outcomes between the individuals with different dietary habits. Examples of cohort studies. First one is the Nurse Health Study (NHS) is one of the largest and longest running cohort studies in the world. It was initiated in 1976 and has followed over 280,000 female registered nurses in the United States. The study collects detailed information on lifestyle factors, medical history, and the health outcomes. The NHS has generated numerous findings related to breast cancer, cardiovascular disease, and other health outcomes. The next one is the Framingham Heart Study, is another famous cohort study that has contributed greatly to our understanding of cardiovascular diseases. The study began in 1948 and has followed generations of residents in Framingham in USA. The study has identified numerous risk factors for cardiovascular diseases, including high blood pressure, high cholesterol, smoking, and diabetes. The Framingham Heart Study has also helped to develop risk prediction models that are widely used in clinical practice. So, in conclusion, in this presentation, we have discussed mainly about the cohort studies, introduction to cohort studies, then how to design of a cohort study, then types of cohort studies, then analyzing data from a cohort study, and applications of cohort study. And at last, we have discussed some examples of cohort studies. Thank you.